You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim du Bois.
Control of the Minnesota State Legislature is on the line this November. Will the Republicans maintain their majorities in the Senate and House? University of Minnesota political science professor Kathryn Pearson weighs in on the state races. In 2010, Minnesota elected a Democratic governor, and we saw the Republicans take control of both the House and the Senate in the state legislature. Do you expect the Republicans to be able to maintain those majorities in the wake of the upcoming elections?
I think it's going to be close. I think there is certainly a good chance that the Senate could go back to DFL control, and not an insignificant chance that the House could as well. Although at this point, I think it's too close to call. But it's interesting. I think, unified government certainly results in more productivity for the party in power. There's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, if the DFL were to have unified party control with the DFL governor and both chambers in DFL control, I think that a lot of DFLers might be disappointed by some of the results because the margins would be narrow and not all DFLers would be willing to rubber stamp the governor's plans.
Do you think the government shutdown last summer, 2011, will have any impact at all on the elections?
I don't think it'll have a huge impact, but I think where skillful DFL challengers can use it against weak Republican incumbents as a campaign issue, it may help along the margins in some legislative districts. But is an overall issue that people are focused on? No. I mean, voters in legislative districts are thinking about the same thing as voters in the presidential election: the economy, jobs, and to a lesser extent, the deficit, the debt, the future of entitlements.
People often view Minnesota as a very reliably blue state, and we've seen, especially for presidential elections, a very strong tendency for Minnesota to vote Democrat. Last time a Republican won Minnesota, from my recollection, was Richard Nixon in 1972. However, are we seeing, is that perhaps not a good, accurate description of the Minnesota electorate? We know that they brought the Republicans to power in the legislature. We've had a history, actually a fairly strong history, of Republican governors for the past 30-some years. Is Minnesota now more accurately called a purple state?
Well, certainly if you're looking at statewide office, I think the purple state description absolutely fits. I mean, we've had certainly with the most recent Senate race in 2008 with Al Franken and Norm Coleman, I mean, razor thin margin. We've had, more Republican governors recently than DFL. Right now we have Republican control of the State House. Yet, Obama is winning by a wide margin. And so I think it really depends on the type of race we're looking at, and you do also have to look at the candidates, but there are some different dynamics at play at the presidential level versus the statewide level. Some of these dynamics are manifest depending on whether or not we're talking about a midterm election where Republican vote turnout tends to be a little bit higher. And sometimes it's based on the quality of the candidate, the economic circumstances, who the incumbent is. But certainly Republicans interested running statewide in Minnesota should not count Minnesota out.
We know that political parties are fluid entities. They have to change with time. They have to change with the demands of the voters. Let's look at the challenges that the two majority parties face. If you look at the Democrats, a lot of the Democrats' agenda is based upon victories that happened 80 years ago. The New Deal. You look at the Great Society of the mid-1960s. Likewise, Republicans have their challenges. It's a demographic in this country that is changing dramatically. We're seeing many, many more people of color. The Republican Party traditionally has had difficulty attracting people of color. We have a huge Hispanic vote that's going to play a big role in this election. How do the parties have to evolve to match the way our electorate is changing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And they evolve both in terms of policy issues and in terms of strategic targeting. And we've seen parties in this cycle and more recent cycles that raise more money than ever before, and they're better at targeting voters, and they're more active. They're, really parties in service of the candidates. On the other hand, we do have parties who are further apart on policy issues than they have been in the past. We certainly see that in comparing their convention platforms, and so it is a challenge for both parties, actually, to attract that moderate voter in the middle, especially because many independent voters, sort of the so-called swing voters that are up for grabs, actually aren't paying as much attention to politics as voters who are already committed to one side or the other. So that's a challenge for the parties, but certainly demographically, Republicans are facing some challenges that Democrats aren't. But Democrats, on the other hand, with the Democratic Party coalition, are facing some challenges, both in terms of turnout and then, frankly, with the many states, 32 states alone in 2012, have passed some sort of voter ID, have passed some sort of voter ID law, although they haven't all been enacted. And so, with the surge in voter ID amendments, laws passed by the legislatures in some of these forms, that could restrict Democratic turnout. So both parties are facing challenges in terms of their coalitions and also appealing to moderate voters.
Polls can often be confusing. What would you suggest that people take into account when they look at the results of a poll? What should we be thinking when we look at those numbers?
I would say two things are key. One, look at the margin of error. If the results are within the margin of error, even if it's, 52 to 48, if it's within the margin of error, it's still a statistical tie. Because these polls, the most recent Star Tribune poll, well-conducted poll, but it comes from a sample of only 800 voters. And that's just the way polling is. It's hard to get respondents, particularly in the age of caller ID and cell phones. So look at the sample size, look at the margin of error, and if the results are within the margin of error, consider it a tie. And then also any poll, even if it's outside the margin of error, so it's a little more telling in terms of a divide, is a snapshot in time. That does not mean that this is what's going to happen on Election Day. And I would add one more thing. Look for change over time, especially in the same poll, because that'll give you some sort of vague idea of where things are trending. And then finally, aggregate as many polls as possible, because some polls are outliers, but if you take them together, that gives you a better sense of where things are. Again, today, a snapshot in time, not necessarily on Election Day.
Kathryn Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Kathryn, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Access Minnesota. Please join us again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.